Hello, my name's Liz Shercliffe, and it's a delight to make this presentation for the Equipping the Called conference. Who wouldn't want to equip the called, particularly when the mission statement of the conference defines equipping the called as expanding horizons, empowering female leaders, and encouraging academic engagement? It really is a privilege to be with you. I'm Director of Studies in the Diocese of Chester, where I focus on teaching preaching modules, both to readers, that's licensed lay ministers in the Church of England, and to ordinands. Before the lockdown, I also taught a preaching module at Queen's in Birmingham to Lichfield readers, and a more ecumenical event I spoke at the Nazarene College in Manchester. I'm a member of the editorial board of the Preacher magazine too, an ecumenical magazine that comes out 4 times a year, focusing on issues of interest to people who preach, and offering ideas on passages which are going to come up in the lectionary in the next 3 months. As a result of an article that I wrote for that magazine in 2014, I became convener of a conference in the Diocese of Chester for women preachers, called Women's Voices. It's an opportunity for women preachers to come together, to network, and to talk about and hear about ideas for women who preach. Most recently, I published this book, Preaching Women, Gender, Power and the Pulpit. And it was a delight before the lockdown to travel around and listen to people who'd read the book or who were interested in the ideas that I develop in it. For me, preaching is both faithful practice of the Church and academic discipline. I'm first and foremost a preacher, and despite some claims that preaching has had its day, that we need to be more entertaining, that people can't listen or concentrate for as long as they used to be able to, and that sermons need to be only a couple of minutes, I still believe in preaching. So let me first of all define what I believe preaching to be. Being a preacher is not about preparing sermons. It isn't about motivating the congregation to follow my particular party line. It isn't about offering erudite exegeses of biblical texts. It's about living a preaching life, finding God in our everyday lives and being able to explain to people where we found God and how they might too. And it's about finding our own voice, preaching authentically as who we are. I don't believe in preaching as faithful propaganda, preaching that tells people what they must believe if they want to be in my gang. I don't believe in preaching as a comfort blanket, preaching that pretends everything is okay even when it isn't, or that if only people would do a particular thing, everything would be okay. I don't believe in selective preaching, preaching that ignores the difficult passages in the Bible, or those that seem to disagree with my preferred view of things. And I don't believe in preaching that is allegedly relevant. We'll come back to that. So let me define preaching and what I do believe about it. My definition of preaching is that it's the art of engaging the people of God in their shared narrative by creatively and hospitably inviting them into an exploration of biblical text, by means of which, corporately and individually, they might encounter the divine. That's a bit complicated, let me say it again. For me, preaching is the art of engaging the people of God in their shared narrative by creatively and hospitably inviting them into an exploration of biblical text, by means of which, corporately and individually, they might encounter the divine. First of all, preaching is art. Preachers should love language. We should play with it. We don't need to get hung up on the length of the sermon. With enough work and by developing our skills, we can say a great deal in a very few words. Listen to this poem by Wendy Cope. She was Eliza for a few weeks when she was a baby. Eliza Lily. Soon it changed to Lil. Later she was Miss Stewart in the baker's shop, and then my love, my darling, mother. Widowed at 30, she went back to work as Mrs. Hand. Her daughter grew up, married, and gave birth. Now she was Nana. Everybody calls me Nana, she would say to visitors. And so they did. Friends, tradesmen, the doctor. In the geriatric ward, they used the patients' Christian names. Lil, we said, or Nana. But it wasn't in her file. And for those last bewildered weeks, she was Eliza once again. That poem is 107 words long, and yet in it we learn about the life of a woman and we even begin to care for her. Preachers should be the church's poets. Preaching, then, is about engaging the people of God, making our language accessible, poetic, beautiful to listen to, allowing space for imagination, not just ours, but the congregation's as well. And there are, I think, 3 other aspects to being engaging. I'm afraid they all begin with the same letter, all letter R. That might sound a little bit old-fashioned, but hopefully it will allow you to remember them. Firstly, I think we need to recognise where we are, what the world around us is like, what are the prevailing issues and attitudes, and how are we experiencing life. Then we need to relate to our congregations. That doesn't mean identifying what we think they need to know. It's thinking about how we are like them. What common ground do we share? And finally, our sermons need to resonate. Sermons need to resonate rather than be relevant. A relevant sermon is about making points. A resonant sermon gives people something to take away with them. Each of these characteristics is affected by the fact that we're women preachers. In fact, I think that they're part of our calling to be women who preach. A preacher who recognises where and when we are will be honest and authentic, aware of her own experience of life, faith and God. Let me play you a clip from a TED Talk by a man who explains how he came to realise where he is and how life was for him.
What do men have to do with gender equality? Gender equality is about women, right? I mean, the word women, the word gender is about women. Actually, I'm even here speaking as a middle-class white man. Now, I wasn't always a middle-class white man. It all happened for me about 30 years ago when I was in graduate school. And a bunch of us graduate students got together one day, and we said, you know, there's an explosion of writing and thinking in feminist theory, but there's no courses yet. So we did what graduate students typically do in a situation like that. We said, okay, let's have a study group. We'll read a text, we'll talk about it, we'll have a potluck dinner. So every week, 11 women and me got together. We would read some text in feminist theory and have a conversation about it. And during one of our conversations, I witnessed an interaction that changed my life forever. It was a conversation between 2 women. One of the women was white, and one was black. And the white woman said, this is going to sound very anachronistic now, the white woman said, all women face the same oppression as women. All women are similarly situated in patriarchy, and therefore, all women have a kind of intuitive solidarity or sisterhood. And the black woman said, I'm not so sure. Let me ask you a question. So the black woman says to the white woman, When you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror, what do you see? And the white woman said, I see a woman. And the black woman said, you see, that's the problem for me. Because when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, she said, I see a black woman. To me, race is visible. But to you, race is invisible. You don't see it. And then she said something really startling. She said, that's how privilege works. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. It is a luxury, I will say, to the white people sitting in this room, not to have to think about race every split second of our lives. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. Now remember, I was the only man in this group. So when I witnessed this, I went, oh no. And somebody said, well, what was that reaction? And I said, well, when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, I see a human being. I'm kind of the generic person. You know, I'm a middle-class white man. I have no race, no class, no gender. I'm universally generalizable. So I like to think that was the moment I became a middle-class white man.
It's by reflecting on experience that we recognise how life really is. If we preach as women, yet fail to recognise that we live in a patriarchal society, worship in a patriarchal church, and read a patriarchal Bible, we fail our hearers. I'll say that again. If we preach as women, and yet we fail to recognise that we live in a patriarchal society, worship in a patriarchal church, and read a patriarchal Bible, we fail our hearers. One of the things that we need to recognise is sexism. As Susan Derby wrote in her book Preaching Like a Woman, it cannot be enough that women adopt the same preaching styles and take just the same texts and speak the same doctrines as the men who have always done, even though despite themselves they will be seen differently. Firstly, we need to read the Bible with alertness, noticing what's really going on. I want to introduce you to my granddaughter Martha. Martha's 7, and the Bible that she's been reading has been a children's Bible. In February this year, after I'd been doing an event related to my book, Martha said to me, "Why are all the women in the Bible pathetic?" After we talked about it, I realised that what she meant was what so many of us already know. Most of the women in the Bible, particularly those that we hear in the lectionary readings or in sermons, are helpless, hopeless, or sinful. Helpless, hopeless, and sinful. Pathetic women in the Bible, according to Martha and what she'd read in her children's Bible. So let's read about some of them. One of my favourites is the woman with the issue of blood in Luke's Gospel, chapter 8. You might remember that a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years creeps through the crowd and goes to see Jesus. And Jesus is on his way to heal Jairus' daughter. And sometimes it's preached numerologically as though there's some kind of conundrum for us to solve. And we notice that the woman's been bleeding for 12 years and Jairus' daughter is 12 years old. But let's read it from the position of power. This woman, we're told, in verse 43, has spent all that she had on physicians. The doctors have been happy to take all her money from her, despite the fact that they're unable to heal her. She may have started off as akin to Jairus, equal to him in social standing in the community. Maybe she had that much money, and yet the physicians took it from her. We have motifs of humility. The woman creeps through the crowd and touches the hem of Jesus' garment. And yet Jesus stoops to lift her to her feet. And part of this story may be that the woman, who has been bleeding for such a long time, very unclean by Levitical law, has been banished from community and from synagogue by Jairus, who's a ruler of the synagogue. those kind of laws were enforced by rulers of synagogues in those days. And so Jesus is escorting Jairus, going back to Jairus' house to heal his daughter, when this woman, marginalized woman, touches the hem of his garment. And what does Jesus do? Stop. Jesus stops the powerful in their tracks and listens to the woman. So this woman is not helpless. This woman is oppressed. And she does something about it. She decides to no longer put up with her oppression, but to fight through the crowd and go to Jesus for herself. Are biblical women hopeless then? Certainly in some cases, the Bible makes it sound as though unless they can have children, or unless they have sons, they are without hope, even without purpose. And so we remember Sarah as barren until she miraculously gives birth to Isaac in old age. We remember Hannah crying in the temple, crying so much that the priest thought she was drunk, because she wanted a child. And then, of course, she has to promise to give the child back to the temple. Women seem to be hopeless unless they can have children. And yet, let's look again. There are Old Testament women who don't have children, Miriam, Deborah, Esther, who bring hope to their people. There are New Testament women who are not known for having children, and yet who make a difference. Mary and Martha of Bethany, Lydia, who begins the first church on European soil, possibly all women. And what about the story of Mary, Jesus' mother, so often made the compliant, pure, virginal girl, and yet a strong woman in so many ways? I really enjoy telling the story in John chapter 2 of the wedding at Cana. Of course, it's the beginning of Jesus' ministry, but Jesus doesn't begin it willingly. He needs a nudge from his mum. When Mary's told that the wine has run out, she reports it to Jesus, who says, "My time hasn't come." And Mary ignores what he says and goes to the servants and tells them to do whatever Jesus says. She's putting him in a position where he has to act. And actually, it's Mary that the servants obey first, before they obey Jesus. It's Mary who says, "Do what he tells you," before Jesus tells them anything. I don't think I need to say very much about the way women are portrayed in the Bible as sinful, or prostitutes, or sexually unclean. One of the well-known stories is of the woman who washes Jesus' feet at Simon the Pharisee's house. Even in my Bible here, it's called a sinful woman forgiven. And the assumption in so many sermons about this passage is that she was a prostitute in the town. And yet let's just look at the evidence for a moment. In verse 45 of the story, Jesus says, "This woman hasn't stopped kissing my feet since I arrived." In other words, the woman was in the house before Jesus got there. Perhaps she was a daughter of the house, or perhaps a servant. Maybe she hadn't earned the money to buy the expensive perfume. Maybe it was her dowry that she was anointing Jesus with. And let's look at another piece of evidence. How did people sit at table in those days? Well, you will know that they reclined and that their feet were behind them. And so in order to wash Jesus' feet as he sat at table, this woman must have been behind him. And yet prostitutes traditionally want to be seen. They stand in front of the clients in order to win business. So the woman is wrongly placed in the story. And finally, let's look at a piece of linguistic evidence. The word that Luke uses to describe this woman, the word sinner, he uses a few chapters earlier, 2 chapters earlier, when Peter says to Jesus, Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. It's the same word. And yet nobody assumes that Simon Peter was some kind of male prostitute. So the evidence at least raises questions about whether this particular woman was the kind of sinner that people assume sometimes that she was. My third R was relating to the congregation. The first thing that happens when anyone stands to preach is that they're seen. We are seen. When a clergywoman preaches from a pulpit, she enters a space which has particular aesthetic value, for this space has been occupied and its character defined by a male presence for centuries. So wrote Virginia Purvis Smith in Gender and the Aesthetic of Preaching. People will make up their minds about what we're about to say even before we open our mouths, just on the basis of how we look. I know that I'm not alone in having had comments made such as, "I didn't listen to you at first with you being a woman, but actually you were quite good." Or, "That was good. I have to ask you where you got it from." And as Teresa Fry Brown's research showed back in 2003, black women preachers are often told that they have too much or too little makeup, too long or too short hair, too colourful or too dull clothes, too low or too high shoes, too long or too shiny earrings, too long or too red fingernails. And I know that such conversations take place among English congregations too. If it's true, and I think it is, that people first see us and make an instant decision about us, then it seems likely that women in the congregation might think something along the lines of, "The preacher's like me," when they see us stand. That might imply an expectation that we experience life, faith, and God in similar ways to them. And then what we go on to say might either validate or invalidate what they feel and what their expectation is. If we do not preach as women and do not take into account the way that we experience life as women, then what effect might that have on our hearers? My suspicion is that it discredits their ways of faith. Way back in 1960, Valerie Saving wrote in The Human Situation, "The temptations of women as women are not the same as the temptations of man as man." Earlier, in 1993, Margaret Gwenther wrote in a book about spiritual direction, Holy Listening, that the time she spent in listening to women's stories convinced her that there are distinctly feminine patterns of sinfulness. Pride is not women's besetting sin, she says, even though many may think so and readily accuse themselves. Even as women talk of pride as their sin, they are feeling worthless and powerless. Women's distinctive sin is self-contempt. Imagine then what might be happening to women in churches where the prevailing narrative is one of worthlessness and sinfulness. The effect on them will be far more devaluing and undermining. In Nicholas Lee's book about women's faith development, where she compares women's faith development with the steps proposed by James Fowler in Stages of Faith, she found that women's faith is dominated by embodied forms of thinking rather than propositional forms of thinking. She speaks about concrete and visual faith, of a faith that's based in real experience of life. And she talks about apophatic faith, a faith that speaks more about what it doesn't know rather than what it does. Challengingly for me, In part of Nicola's conclusion, she says this: preachers have a key role in naming and validating women's experience. So we've talked about recognising and relating. I want finally to talk about resonant preaching rather than relevant preaching. Relevant preaching makes points. It tries to make links between the heart of the sermon and people in the congregation. It might look a bit like this. You can see that there are points and a centre here. But you can also see that there are spaces between the points. People who are not reached by a sermon, perhaps. It's a little bit like a spider's web. It looks beautiful when all the threads hold. But if one thread breaks, it becomes simply a dust trap, useless. Resonant sermons, on the other hand, open up. They allow space for people. Can you see that? Or to change metaphors, they're like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples spread out. And so the sermon is like a hole, a stone, a complete object that goes into the pond and has an effect, ripples outwards. And it doesn't matter how far from the centre the people in the congregation are, the ripples will still reach them. Likewise, time-wise, a resonant sermon will last. People will continue to think about it through the following week, maybe even longer. A resonant sermon does not finish with the preacher's Amen. About 5 years ago, at a dinner, I met the Right Reverend Dr. John Chalmers, moderator of the Church of Scotland. He gave me this, which I've treasured. It's a sign of his ministry of bringing peace to places. This is made from glass broken in Bethlehem by bombs that Israeli soldiers have aimed at Palestinians. But that night, John said something that really struck me. He said that he believed that the big justice issue for the next decade would be justice for women, gender justice. The challenge that John issued that evening led to me writing this book, actually, and I want to read a little bit of it to you now because I think it's my attempt to talk about gender justice and the church. We cannot denounce the ill treatment of girls around the world through FGM or prostitution or low wage or anything else if we tolerate actions and attitudes that marginalise them in our own congregations. We cannot denounce the ill treatment of women around the world if we preach from a Bible that treats them as sources of temptation and sin. We have to speak the truth persistently about sexism in the world, in the church, and in the Bible. I am not convinced that we have a gospel to proclaim if the gospel we proclaim does not require gender equality. I don't accept that there can be good news for some, but not for others, or that good news for some is more important than good news for all. Preaching, then, for me, is a matter of academic discipline. It's also a matter of faithful practice. We're called to work at it as women preachers, to identify with our congregations. We're also called to work at it as women disciples. It is a matter of justice, but it's also more than that. To finish, let me read you the last paragraph of my book. Developing women's preaching and developing women preachers is not simply about equality. It's much more important than that. It drives at the heart of God's self-revelation to and through humanity. and God's performative grace in creation. When God's revelation is warped by exclusion or dismembered by suppression, all people suffer. The fullness of God's presence in our lives needs God's activity in both women and men to be manifest. Otherwise, both exalted men and excluded women suffer.